Thank you, Professor. There's really not much to apologize for because I just heard that we're under very stiff competition. There are like 3 other events going on tonight. And so those who are here chose to be here, you see. Yeah, so we're glad, no? We're glad for that, right? So I promise not to make this talk too philosophical, because I understand that some are studying philosophy and some aren't. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually to give I'm actually going to do a religious studies approach to the question of mission. Yeah, and put it in the context of China. All right. Okay, that's something that's something like what I should do tonight. Okay. Right. So let's start with looking at maximum elude. Right. And I got some points. They are related to China. Okay, that's for our consideration. Right. So Benedict XV observes that Gregory X was the one who sent missionaries to China, right? And the Franciscan missionaries were the first people to establish a Christian community. Unfortunately, they did not survive persecution. Right? So this is mentioned, right, the part about China. Right? And I like this very much. Benedict XV says this very strongly in a particular context. Benedict is talking about the need for local clergy, native clergy, right? And so he says that the church cannot be seen as an intruder in any country. So the church must be seen to be a local entity, let us say. Right? She's not alien to any people. This will make a lot of sense later in the talk. Right? It's particularly, for me, it is particularly poignant. Okay? And the Pope also tells us that, the missionary represents the gospel, right? And therefore, the missionary cannot be seen to be a member of a foreign power. So we know about this. Right? Because the people are aware of what the missionary is trying to do in their country. Right? If the missionary is being seen as an agent of a foreign power, then immediately the missionary comes under suspicion. And we've seen this throughout history, like Saint Teresa of Calcutta, right, was seen as a proselytizer for Christianity, when she wanted to simply work with the most abandoned, the poorest, right? Okay, and this part was very relevant, I thought. Right? The Pope Benedict actually says this: there are some dangers that we have to avoid in missionary work. Right? First, Christianity must not be seen as a national religion of a foreign country. Yeah, he says that. It's 100 years ago. Of course, he's talking about a different context. He was talking about Christianity should not be seen as a European religion, but it's still relevant to us now, right? And conversion to Christianity must not be seen as being disloyal to your own culture, to your own country. And becoming Christian does not involve submitting yourself to a foreign power. Okay. Oh, by the way, I'm perfectly happy to send you my PowerPoints. Yes. Okay. So if after the talk, if you just give me your email address, I'll be happy to send them to you. Yeah. I always give my notes to my students. Yes, I do. My students know. Yeah. So don't worry about copying. Just take it easy. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I will get your contact after this. All right. Okay. Yeah. So this is about maximum elude. Right. So those are the starting point for tonight's reflection. The idea of the missionary being enculturated, to enable the church to be seen as a friendly and a native entity, right? And let us start with a couple of definitions to help us with tonight's reflection. Right? So, in the church documents, we understand dialogue to be any kind of relationship with a non-Christian faith. Right? And the purpose is to develop mutual understanding. Right? So it could be, for example, dialogue between Christianity and Islam. Okay? And the purpose is for Muslims to understand Christians better, and the other way around. That Christians have to understand Muslims better. Right? So it's a kind of mutual relationship, a mutual enrichment involved. Right? And then proclamation, as we are very aware of, it just means preaching the gospel. Right? And so in our context, in our time, let us say, we now see that dialogue and proclamation are complementary, right? Especially in Asia, right? Because when we speak to a non-Christian, it's not likely that you're going to meet an atheist, right? Or it's very likely you're going to speak to a Buddhist. If you're going to talk to a non-Christian, you're going to talk to a Buddhist, or a Muslim, or a Taoist, a Hindu, and so on, right? So these two have to go together in the project of evangelization, right? So with that in mind, then let us go to the beginning, right? Then look at the three teachings, right? The San Jiao He Yi, right? And it literally means the unity, right? The three teachings united into one, right? It literally means that, right? Okay. So how did this concept come about, right? Now, it's a kind of the best way to explain this, right, is to say that this three teachings discourse is a genre of writing. It's a type. It's a literary genre. Okay. And it's a way of speaking about religious pluralism. Okay. If you like, you can say that it's a way of speaking about religious pluralism in a politically correct way in the Chinese context. All right. And so we can say that it refers to the way that the Chinese scholars have spoken about Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, right? Starting from around the time of the 4th century. Okay? So, why was there a need to begin this kind of discourse? Okay? So we know that by the 2nd century, the Han dynasty, the Buddhism had entered China. Okay? By then, possibly earlier, but we know that by the 4th century, by the 2nd century, Buddhism entered China, right? And Buddhism began to be perceived as a Taoist sect. Okay, there are several reasons for this. One thing is that the early Buddhist missionaries studied Taoist texts to get vocabulary for translating the Buddhist sutras. Okay, to get the vocabulary. And so then in the minds of people, it sounded kind of Taoist. Buddhism sounded kind of Taoist. Right? And Buddhism had to present itself as a distinct religion from Taoism. Right? Okay? And this is the origin of how would I say this? This is the early justification for three teachings discourse. Okay? That's from the I Ching, right? Which means Shu Tu Tong Gui, right? It means that the ways were distant and they belong together, right? I mean, those of us who know Chinese, you can guess the meaning, right? It means that the ways were different, were separate, and then they belong together. Right? And this comes from the I Ching. Now, this chapter of the I Ching became very powerful as a justification because allegedly it was written by Confucius. Okay, so it's probably not the case. Okay? But because of this idea, which was found in a classical Confucian text, and Buddhists used it. Okay, that it's possible that the different traditions lead to the same goal, right? That is enlightenment. Right? Okay, so we know that Taoism became important politically later part of the 5th century. Okay, that's when the disputes began. Right? So the early disputes were actually between Buddhism and Taoism in China. Right? So here's an idea of how a three teachings discourse might appear in a text. No? Suppose a Taoist is trying to argue for the tradition against Buddhism. Right? So in a piece of writing, right, they will say that, well, Taoism is the same as Buddhism. You know? And then after that, they will say that, yeah, even though it's the same, right, Taoism is actually more appropriate for the Chinese people. Right? Okay? And then the idea is that they want to convince the reader that Taoism is better, more suitable in Chinese culture. Right? So whatever Buddhism has, Taoism has as well. And we do it in a better way. So you should be Taoist. That's the polemic behind the... So there's no... The idea is to argue for the superiority of Taoism without offending the Buddhists. That's the general idea going on. Okay? So I'm sure you have heard some of these stories before. Okay? Those Taoist polemics, these quarrels between Taoists and Buddhists. Right? So one of them is this, right? That Buddhism is the corrupt version of Taoism. Right? So like Lao Tzu, Lao Tzu is the founder of the legendary founder of Taoism, the one who wrote the Tao Te Ching, the first text, right? So Lao Tzu went west. After he wrote the Tao Te Ching, he traveled west to convert the barbarians. Okay, so when he went west, it means that he went to India or Central Asia, right? Okay, and so he gave his teachings in India, and then Taoism returned to China as Buddhism. And there are, of course, stories that say the reverse, right? That Taoism is a corrupt version of Buddhism. Yeah, because it was polemical. Yeah? You've heard these stories before, I'm sure, no? And it's very confusing because who is right? It's polemic. It's like rhetoric, you see? Right? So the conclusion that you're supposed to get is this, right? That Buddhism is just misunderstood Taoism, right? And Taoism is superior because it was preserved in China, right? So there's nothing wrong with being a Buddhist, but being Taoist is better. Well, you still get some enlightenment if you are a Buddhist, no? But being Taoist is better because it's the original, you see? So that's the general idea that you'll get from this kind of discourse, right? Okay, so going now to the 6th century, okay, so we know that Chinese Buddhists were hesitant to accept this three teaching discourse, right? And this should sound familiar to us, to those of us who know something about church history. This might sound familiar, right? So to state the superiority of Buddhism, right, it was identified as 出世间 it means literally it means out of this world, right? Out of this world. And then Confucianism and Taoism are 世教, means that the teachings, worldly teachings. Yeah, right? So there was a reverse polemic, right? To say that Buddhism is superior to Confucianism and Taoism. So this is the time when Buddhism was already enculturated, right? But notice this, right? The reason for the polemic is that Buddhism is the foreign religion, right? Because Buddhism is the one that originally came from India. Yeah, I mean we know that Siddhartha Gautama was born in what northern India, which is what we call Nepal. Now, right? So this kind of polemics came about because Buddhism had to, in a sense, justify its position as a Chinese tradition. That it is same but not equal. Right? Right? So Buddhists had to deal with these kind of questions. Right? For example, should a monk bow before an emperor? Right? Sounds familiar? Because these were kind of things that Christians faced in Roman Empire. Right? And they also argued about some metaphysical things, no? About would the soul survive physical death? You know, these kind of questions came about. Right? But the main thing is actually this. Okay? The main thing, there were disputes between Taoists and Buddhists, of course. Okay? But the main concern is to see, is it possible to reconcile Buddhism with Confucianism? Right? And there were a lot of questions because, for example, Buddhists advocated monastic life, right? And that meant celibacy. Right? So celibacy meant that you did not have descendants for your parents, and that was not being filial. Right? So it seemed to be against family values, you know, which were advocated by Confucians. And so Buddhism had this challenge. They faced the challenge of reconciling their teachings to the Confucian worldview. Right? So, for example, the Buddhists instituted, right, that before a man could become a monk, he must get permission from his parents, you know, to adjust, you know, to adapt to the Confucian system. Right? So these three teaching discourses, okay, actually have an apologetic character. They are defensive in purpose. Right? Okay? And a good number of them are about this: defending Buddhism against Confucian attacks. Right? Okay? And so to argue that the three traditions are in harmony, okay, it's not about the character of the religions themselves. Okay? To assert the harmony between the three traditions is to adopt a position on religious pluralism. Okay, that's why I said earlier, right? The three teachings discourses is a way to speak about religious pluralism in a politically correct way in the context of China. Okay? So this is interesting. I found out about this recently. Right? So in 574, Zhou Wudi ordered a ban on Taoism and Buddhism. Okay? And then the North and South were united in 589, and then Sui Wendi revoked the ban. Okay, so this was the time that created a flourishing of these three teaching discourses. Okay, because Buddhism and Taoism became, let us say, legitimized. Okay, so this period was a time when emperors began to get involved in 3 teaching discourses. Okay, so, for example, they wrote commentaries on the texts. Right? And in reality, what they were doing was to institute policy on religious practice. Okay, does that sound familiar? Happens also in Christianity. The emperor gets involved in the church council, and he wants to institute policy on religious practice to keep the harmony of the people in the empire. Right? Sounds familiar, right? Okay, you should. So it's not very foreign to. It should not sound very foreign to us, because every civilization faces this challenge, religious pluralism. Okay, and the intention of the emperors was to integrate the 3 teachings, okay, under Confucian ideology. So we're familiar with this, right? And this is interesting also. Right? I found out that in this incident, right, in 635, there's evidence that Nestorianism was classified as jiao, teaching. Yeah, jiao. Okay. And in the 14th century, 1309, right, there's a recognition of Buddhism, Taoism, Nestorianism, and Islam, okay, on an institutional level. Okay, so when they are exempt from taxes, it's a kind of state support, right, the state recognition. Okay, so you will notice that Confucianism is never mentioned because the state is Confucian. Right? Okay, but the inclusion of Nestorianism and Islam as one of the teachings of China is exceptional. It's exceptional. Okay, it's not. You will not see that in the tradition. Okay, they were isolated incidents. But it's interesting that it happened. Right? Okay. It's part of the argument now. In the contemporary times, there's some government discourse from China that says that Confucianism was used to read Islamic texts and all that. It still goes on now, today. Right? I think that's quite fascinating, from a religious studies point of view. Okay. So the important thing to understand is this. Harmony among the 3 teachings is not a part of the traditions themselves. Okay? There's nothing in Confucianism or Taoism or Buddhism that advocates harmony with each other. No. Okay? It's very misleading because it is presented as such. Like, ordinary Chinese people speak about San Jiao He Yi as if that the traditions themselves advocate harmony. Okay? The discourse was created to respond to a question of potential division in the culture. Right? And the purpose of creating an identity of unity is really for survival. Right? For example, the survival of Buddhists in the face of Confucian ideology, for example. Right? Or the survival of Buddhism in the face of Taoist attack. That's the reality. Okay? And this one is quite subtle. When you read an essay on 3 teachings, right, you will see that one teaching is always considered superior, but it's never said explicitly. And they say some very beautiful things. Like they will say that, Buddhism is applied to the cultivation of the mind. Taoism is applied to the cultivation of the body. Then Confucianism is used for the government of the world. So they work together, you see. Which is more important? Last one, right? So there's a superiority involved in one of the teachings, right? But it's not said too directly, Okay. So we have a concept of unity but not equality, right? It's kind of, I wouldn't say it's subversive, but it's subtle, very subtle. Okay. So here's a couple of conclusions. Okay. So there is no evidence. Okay. There's no evidence that the harmony between the three traditions ever existed in practice. It's a discourse. Okay. And many people believe it. Really? Yeah. Okay. So the discourse does not have institutionalized reality. Okay. We can say that it's an ideal, and it's widely believed. Okay. So it's a strategy to regulate the situation of religious pluralism. Okay. And there is a model of toleration involved. Okay. The reason is that they would prefer not to quarrel among themselves. Right. So they decide not to reject another tradition. Right, so here's an example that is relevant for our consideration. I just read this report. It came out in May, right? just last month. Okay? There was a report that religious leaders in China were brought for a Confucian immersion program. Okay? So they went to Chifu, which is, as we know, the birthplace of Confucius. Right? So we know who was there. We know who were there. Right? Representative of Taoist Association, Islamic Association, Catholicism, and the Protestants. Right? Okay. And publicly, they had to make this kind of statement. Right? That is that as religious leaders, they go for this Confucian immersion program to pay attention to excellent Chinese culture, Confucianism, right? Okay. Which is traditionally known as state ideology. Right? And religions have to integrate with Chinese culture. Right? And not only that, we have to cultivate the cultural character of the religions in China. Okay? And here's a buzzword. All religions in China must advance Sinicization. Okay? Okay, Christianity, Islam must become more Chinese, whatever that means. Okay? So, I think we are aware of this, right? I think you are aware of this. In our current times, today, right, Chinese government still views Christianity and Islam as foreign religions. Right? It's just a fact. Yeah. It's unfortunate, but it's a fact. Right? So let's go back to Maximum Illud and Benedict XV. Right? He says that the church should never be seen as an intruder. Right? And we also know this, that especially since the time of Xi Jinping, Confucianism has been promoted actively. Right? So, here's the final part of the lecture, and that is about dialogue. Right? So, very probably you might guess where I'm going with this. Probably, right? Okay, so the strategy that I will propose for evangelization is that Christianity should engage in dialogue with Confucianism, right, in order to advance the project of conversion. Right? So let us look at dialogue for a while, right? Okay, so when in the church documents, when we speak about intercultural dialogue, okay, culture means anything that human beings make or do to express their values, their life, right? Could be their lifestyle, could be their, the food, right? What they make, could be their art, the sense of beauty, right? How they organize themselves, even. Right? So culture can be anything that expresses human values and their way of life. Okay? But culture is broader than religion on this account. Okay? But very importantly, our understanding in the church, religion is the transcendent dimension of culture. In fact, religion can transform and promote culture. Yes. Okay. So, here are three possibilities. Right? In the face of religious pluralism, there are three possibilities. Okay. So either we can respect each other and leave each other alone. There is relativism. Okay. We could bring the others into the majority. There is assimilation. Or we could treat all parties equally. And that is engage in intercultural dialogue. Right? So, relativism takes different traditions to be autonomous. Okay? They are incommensurable. They are isolated, right? Okay? And when we adopt a relativist worldview, then every culture has an absolute value. It cannot change, or we should not change it. Yeah? Okay? And so the intention is very good. Okay? That is tolerance. Right? That we respect the other by not forcing them to change. Right? Okay. So the issue here is that if we adopt relativism, then dialogue is impossible. Right? And there is no mutual recognition. It's not possible to engage each other. Another possibility is assimilation. Okay? And that would be demanding that the foreigner adopt the local culture. Okay? Meaning that if you wish to live in our culture, adopt our ways, learn our language, follow our values, and learn our history, and so on. Right? This involves inserting minority cultures into the majority culture. Right? This should sound familiar because this may or may not be what's going on in China today. So, assimilation is always a project that is advanced by a culture that is a rising power. Okay? So, when a culture has evolved substantially, right, it will try to promote its own cultural values, right, whether by economic means or even military means. Right? Okay. So what the church recommends is this, okay, to work on this. Promotion of intercultural dialogue. So, in order for dialogue to be possible, right, we have to understand the parties involved in the dialogue. Right? So, if there's going to be dialogue between Christians and Confucians, right, then there must be a possibility that the Confucians can be transformed by the Christians. And there must be a possibility for Christians to be transformed by the Confucians. And at the same time, the Christian must learn Confucianism, and the Confucian must learn Christianity. Right? Yes. So you must understand each other. Right? The possibility of mutual transformation must be there. Otherwise, there cannot be genuine dialogue. Okay? So the idea is that culture is dynamic. It's not static. It can change. Right? So when Christianity becomes, I don't like the word, but when Christianity becomes Sinai-sized, it might look like it takes on Confucian character or Confucian characteristics. It might. Okay? And that should not be seen as a bad thing, in my opinion. Okay? So intercultural dialogue is actually very positive because it promotes, mutual transformation and meeting each other, meeting the other, right? Not treating the other as somebody that we cannot understand, right? And having this openness, right, helps us to live together, and in the future we can deal with possible conflicts, right? Okay. And ultimately, okay, there must be some integration at the level of mutual recognition. This is the ideal, right? Integration of cultures. Okay. So we know this, no? In the history of Christianity, we have always promoted dialogue, no? In the time of the fathers, no? Fathers of the church, right? They dialogue with those that are those of another tradition, right? Like Justin the Martyr, when he became Christian, dialogue with the philosophers and dialogue with the Romans. And so Christianity has always had this tradition of dialogue with others, with the world, those that are not, with those people outside the church. Right? And the purpose is to promote fraternity. Right? And I would argue that dialogue is more important than ever. Right? Because we face a situation, for example, that China is a rising power. Right? So we can make a choice. Right? Either we engage in dialogue and work for integration and mutual recognition, or we face the danger of assimilation. Right? Okay. Because relativism is not an option. Because relativism leads us to having no contact, no possibility of engagement. There is respect, but there is no contact, you see. So it seems to me that the choice is very stark. Either engage in dialogue or we will be assimilated. Right, so that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. Just my references. This is the main article that I took the material from. This is the report, and these are the church documents.
Can I ask a question? Do you want to ask one first? I'll bring this to you. You ask the first question. No, I do though, because I need to be able to hear you, and so do the people watching at home on television through the miracle of the internet.
When you started by saying that the three. Yes, I'm trying to avoid.
I understand.
But you started by talking about the three three teachings as a form of political correctness. Yes. Well, I don't like political correctness, and so I thank you for your talk. But if you would allow me to make it a little bit politically incorrect, to challenge you. Very interesting, but I wonder how this intercultural dialogue is not a means to somewhat water down the message of Christianity. Yeah. How can it do if it's not a danger of watering down the message of Christianity? And also, when we talk about the relationship between the church and other cultures, that relationship has, I have here, I have here a quotation from, I don't have it anymore, from Fides et Ratio. Fides et Ratio, which is by John Paul II, but of course we know who wrote it or whose hand is behind all of this. It says, in engaging great cultures for the first time, the Church cannot abandon what she has gained from her inculturation in the world of Greco-Latin thought. To reject this heritage would be to deny the providential plan of God, who guides his church down the paths of time and history. This criterion is valid for the church in every age. So, as we can see from it, it does suggest that not every culture is the same, not every dialogue is the same, and not every inculturation is possible. And surely there must be, even if we don't consider the question of I don't want to say primate, although that comes to mind, of Latin and Greek thought, there has to be questions of incompatibility between certain cultures and certain religious thought. I think, in my opinion, that the idea that we can always live in peace, and can be all very nice, it's unreal. And as we have seen, mission is painful, and is supposed to be painful. Actually, normally we used to say some years ago that the mission was paved by the blood of martyrs and others who gave their blood for the growth of the church. I don't know if you've seen, there is a very beautiful movie from the 1940s or something. I think it's called The Nun. It is a real history with not Catherine Hepburn, the other one, the other Hepburn.
Audrey Hepburn.
Oh, exactly, Audrey Hepburn. Well, I'm going to let that for you. At some point in the missions in Africa, they have help from natives who are pagans, and they keep on being pagans even though they are working in the mission, up until the moment when one of the nuns is killed. And then you see that some of them start wearing a cross when they see, and the suggestion there is that without blood, without sacrifice, without martyrdom, there won't be mission, there won't be Christianization, if you see. And even the process of mission or Christianization, although, as I tell you, this sounds terribly politically incorrect, and I would imagine that, well, anyway, very difficult to hear to some people, but my question is, don't you think that this dialogue is, in a way, I'm not saying that dialogue is not necessary, but often dialogue is, how should I put this? I don't want to be too politically incorrect. I don't want to offend anyone. But I'm just going for the watering down. I'm going to water down my own argument. And if that is cannot compromise what is a process of mission is for the Christianization. The word, the verb says it all, I would think. Okay, and I don't want to take any more time. Thank you.
Right. So, thank you, Professor. It's very valid questions, and these are very valid concerns, right? So I will pick up 2 points that are very important that you raised, okay? So the first point is this. When Christianity engages in dialogue, does it involve watering down our doctrine? Okay? So I would say not necessarily. Okay? Because the point of dialogue is that we should try to find a bridge. Like, for example, to help Chinese people understand Christianity. To find a point of value in their own culture that helps them to receive the gospel. So take, for example, like Chinese people, because of the Confucian background, they stress this very much. Xiao, filial piety, is very strong, very deep in Chinese thinking. Right? So it could be presented that, well, the 10 Commandments has this honor your father and mother. Right? And this is part of the Christianity, and that it is not foreign for a Chinese to adopt the 10 Commandments, for example, right? So I think that the point is not to change Christianity to suit Chinese tastes. No, I don't mean that. No, so that's not the point of dialogue. The point of dialogue is to search for common values, if any, to facilitate the preaching of the gospel that will be more acceptable to the cultural context. You know, that's one point. No? So the point is this, no? The Pope Benedict tells us this, that conversion to Christianity should not be seen as being disloyal to my native culture, I say. I think that will be the point. I mean, this is from Maximum Illud. Yeah. So then the next point is this, no? You are right, that in Fides et Ratio, it talks about the Greco-Roman roots of Scripture, right? The language of Revelation, right? And Benedict XVI talks about it as well, no? The de-Hellenization of, yes. So again, the issue applies. The same issue applies. Right? When we translate the text, we have to find some similar, if not parallel, concept in the language. You see. So, for example, I'm not a biblicist. I'm way out of my league here. But for example, in philosophical circles, okay, there is some agreement, for example, that the concept Tao, the way, right, okay, can be an analogous concept to Logos. Okay, there's one suggestion. Okay, but the point is this: if we are to explain the meaning of Logos to a Chinese, we have to find a parallel or analogous concept that they can relate to. Otherwise, we would demand that every Chinese must learn Greek before they understand Christianity. That can't be the case, right?
Keep you very busy.
So I think this is the point of intercultural dialogue. The purpose is to facilitate the preaching of the gospel, to help it make sense to someone in their own native culture. So it doesn't involve watering down. In fact, I would argue that the church thinks that, for example, the purpose of dialogue between Christianity and Confucianism is to Christianize Confucianism. Because religion is transcendent dimension of culture. I mean, that's my understanding.
You have to have the microphone. I persecuted Roberto. You've got to have the microphone.
Will it work? Okay. You mentioned Zhou Wudi and Sui Wendi.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the political context of these two issues that happened in a very short period of time between one another? I assume that Sui Wendi is the founder of the Sui dynasty, or the second, and Zhou Wudi is coming out of some political turmoil prior to the founding of the Sui dynasty.
Yeah. So the Sui dynasty is the period of the unity of the North and South after 400 years. Right? And so Confucianism was used as an ideology to unite the kingdom, and it was seen in an exclusivistic way. Right? So after the union of the North and South, okay, the ban on non-Confucian religions was lifted, and a new way of organizing the empire came about. Okay? And that was the imperial involvement in three teaching discourse. It was done at a top-down, let us say. In the beginning, it was done between, let's say, Buddhist scholars and Taoist scholars. And then later on, it became something that came from an official level. Is that? Mm. Yes. 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 Yes.
Can you elaborate on him at all? His origins and objectives?
Objectives of yeah. The objective of banning Taoism and Buddhism.
Yeah. From what dynasty was that?
Let me see. I have to look it up. I'm not sure at the moment. Yeah. Yes. But, yeah. I don't know the background of this ban. Yeah.
Jan, you have to have the microphone. This is an inflexible rule.
Thank you, Father Edmund, for such an interesting talk. Just want to comment on the last point that you talked about before the dynasty situation. How a lot of catechism classes in Macau, or very likely in Hong Kong as well, that obviously there is a lot of Christianization of Confucianism going on. So the adaptation of our pop culture, or even Korean soap opera, everything could be integrated into making non-believers try to adapt to Christianity. And the convincing version of that strategy can be seen as very harmonious as well. I just want to add to that. There is that constant effort going on by church clergy, minister, and I earlier on when you talk about assimilation in mainland China, that might be some of the queries that I might have. That do you know the extent of situations? Probably not in big cities, but maybe in smaller provinces. Do you know of any rapid assimilation that Christian teaching might need to give into local culture?
So that's a very nice point. Okay, I should have mentioned this, and I think it's worth talking about this. Yeah. Right. So I think Chan brings up this point. There is already a movement to Confucianize Christianity. It's ongoing, right? And one of the ways of doing this is to is precisely the work of Confucianizing Christianity will precisely water down Christianity. Okay? And so it's important for the church to enter into dialogue, because we have to take the initiative to Christianize Confucianism. Okay? See, take for example, there is a scholar a Confucian scholar who studied at Harvard. He is Tu Weiming. Okay, yeah. Then he recently came back to work in China. He's in Beijing now. He runs this humanistic center for studies in Beijing University, Peking University. Right. He's one of the few local Chinese scholars who studied in the West, right? And he reads Confucianism with transcendence. Yes. So he takes religious studies approach to reading Confucian texts. Right? Okay. And this is not the popular opinion. Because the popular reading of Confucianism now is that it is simply philosophical and moral. It upholds ethical values, strengthens the relationships of the family and the citizens with the ruler, and so on. Right? And so it's important to engage in this dialogue that can Christianize Confucianism before we become assimilated, before Christianity is Confucianized, I think. Because if we lose this chance, right, then religion does not become the transcendent dimension of culture. Okay. That's my take on this.
I have always understood, or maybe I was mistaken, that I understood Confucianism as a philosophy, not as a religion. So now that because you said that 3 religions, so that is my how is it? Because what you are saying now,
yes.
How could we confuse the transcendence of religion, of our faith, should even Christianize philosophy?
Yes. So this is a very if you were to talk, for example, no, if you were to talk to Chinese from mainland China, right, you tell them that I read Confucianism as a religion, they'll be shocked. Yeah, this is the prevailing opinion, that Confucianism is not a religion. Yeah, yes, I understand why. Okay, but I can tell you, from my studies with the text, okay, it's just being ignored. For example, in the MMXX, no, the Lunju, you have Confucius speaking about Tian, which is it means sky. In Chinese, it just means sky. No, what is above, right? And then he speaks about Tian Ming, the mandate of heaven, or the decision of heaven, right? Okay. Or Confucius says that heaven has abandoned me. Heaven has bereft me when he suffers the death of his beloved disciple Yan Hui. You know, now think about this. How can heaven not be a personal being? If heaven makes decisions, it must be an intelligent power. Right? Tian Ming. If heaven can make decisions, it must be intelligent. Right? If Confucius is abandoned, he must think that heaven understands him. So he has a relationship with heaven. Right? So I'm not here to argue that heaven is personal or impersonal. I'm not here to resolve this question. But the point is that there is room for a religious reading of Confucianism. I would definitely argue that, because there is an element of transcendence. Right? Think about this. We would not have problems thinking that Buddhism is a religion. We don't have a problem with that. Right? All of us can, I think, most of us can agree that Buddhism is a religion. But Buddhism does not have a belief in a personal being. Right? So why is it that we exclude considering Confucianism as a religion just because there's no personal being? There's a prejudice involved.
Somebody gets a second question.
Very brief.
I'm feeling generous.
Very brief, coming from the answer you just gave, not this last one, the previous one.
Yes.
And coming from your talk. So is it your opinion that Christianity in China cannot be not Confucianized?
In the short to medium term, yes. It seems to me that based on the history of Chinese culture, right, the development of Chinese culture, like Confucianism has played such a long and powerful role in the country. And now with the strong promotion of Confucianism again, it seems that in the short to medium term, the best chance to facilitate evangelization is to have Christianity dialogue with Confucianism. That's my opinion. Strategy, yes, of course.
But you talk about it in terms of it being in dialogue, and in your previous answer you seem to imply the purpose of that being to Christianize Confucianism before the other side got their assimilation in first.
Yes.
I'm delighted to hear that, and I'd say that I think Christian history, so far as we understand it at least, indicates that that is not a unique problem in China, and to pick up Roberto's comments about the blood of the martyrs being the seed of the church or the seed of Christians, I think we know where that goes. What I'm particularly interested in is the notion of the way in which the three teachings are held together in a manner, yes, polemical, yes, apologetic, but ultimately relativist, in the sense of saying all things are equally true. And you're the philosopher and I'm not, but it seems to me to imply if all things are equally true, then they're all equally untrue. Mm-hmm. Christianity can't participate in that kind of process simply by virtue of the exclusive claims that we make when we look at Christ and we utter that fundamental Christian creed, Jesus is Lord. Does that inevitably mean that dialogue, which is at the service of proclamation, I think that seems to be the dynamic, leads to Christian witness, mm-hmm. and witness understood as martyrdom?
Yeah, it's a very strong point that you carried on from Professor Roberto. I'm not a big fan of martyrdom. So for myself. So
which of us is?
My first wish.
Listen, my dear chap, I have to use softener for my vests.
my first wish is that we could is if we could engage in dialogue and lead to proclamation without having anybody to die in the process.
It doesn't.
Wouldn't that be much more preferable?
Well, would it be preferable? Sorry?
Yes.
Yes, although to be fair, there is some evidence that he died on the cross so that you and I don't have to. Although, on the other hand, we also have to take it up. It doesn't seem to be any part of Christian history, brackets or aspiration, close brackets, until the late 20th century, that's even possible. And the late 20th century onwards has not been marked, as I demonstrated in that first lecture, by a significant increase in the proportion of human beings who are attracted to Christianity. In fact, actually, if you look at the figures insofar as they're at all secure, the time in which the church has grown most quickly throughout the world has been immediately following times of persecution, and not when she's tried to get away with it ironically. So is perhaps dialogue as a way of avoiding martyrdom, in fact, fundamentally counter-historical?
So
we have these kinds of discussions every day,
so,
don't we?
so
That's why your assignments don't get marked on time.
So you're making an argument that we're going in the direction that martyrdom is an inevitable part of evangelization.
Well, I think, not necessarily being thrown to lions or hanged upside down or hanged, drawn and quartered, as my own country specialised in for some time.
Yeah.
No, I have to say, I think you made it very clear, and as a member of the Order of Preachers, so you should, that dialogue is at the service of the proclamation of the good news, that is Jesus Christ. And you endorsed, I'm pleased to hear, that view of the kind of scandal of particularity that means that we can't set aside the unique providential fusing of Athens, Rome and Jerusalem, if you like. But it seems to me that the hope that this will then result in some kind of harmonious, fraternal, peaceful conversion of the world is neither what we learn from Christian history, nor, frankly, is it what we're promised in the texts of the New Testament that look forward to the coming of the kingdom. That seems to me to be almost always marked by a sense that it's going to get worse and worse and worse until God acts and comes again.
Right. Okay. So I will keep this. I will reply to this point this way. Okay. I don't know enough about the history of the missions to affirm or to deny that martyrdom is an inevitable part of evangelization. Okay? I don't know enough of it. Okay? But I will say this. Right? Pope Benedict XV spoke about this, right? That there was an attempt to evangelize in China. I mean, it failed or succeeded, depending on how you see it. But Christianity did not survive. Okay? And I'll confess to you one thing tonight. I didn't say this, but I'll confess it to you now. Okay? The reason why I started getting interested in studying this three teaching discourse was because of my interaction with East Asian people. I've always been marveled. I've always marveled at how successful Buddhism is as a missionary religion. When you speak to a Korean, for example, right? Korean people think that Buddhism is a Korean religion. Yeah. China has no problem seeing Buddhism as a Chinese religion. I mean, it's Indian, right? So I begin to think: could it be that it is a question of inculturation? Could it be that Christianity is not well understood in these East Asian cultures? I'm talking about China, Japan, and Korea. And could it be that Confucianism might be a way to facilitate this enculturation? So that's my take on it. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? You've worked very hard.
We've already passed. We're way past the...
Edmund, thank you very much. You've stimulated. You've stimulated great discussions, which I know will carry on afterwards. They'll certainly carry on in the faculty staff room. If you hear of the story of a young Dominican priest being burned in the courtyard of the Seminario de San Jose, the likely culprits are either Professor Roberto Chairlin or Professor Stephen Morgan. It'll be interesting subjecting a Dominican to the Inquisition, but it's all right. Father Javier is here to ensure that we conduct it canonically. Edmund, I think you've given us so much thought, so much food for thought, and I hope that we are able to kind of explore this more later in the year, maybe after these lectures, because I think you touch upon a very important point, and that is the resistance of East Asian cultures to the evangelizing efforts of the Church thus far. Those of you who would like a copy of Father Edmund's slides should write their names and email addresses on the piece of paper that Sister Judette has now confiscated. This time I can say you can go away now and not come back until the end of the summer. Our next lecture is in October, and I think it's you, Father Franz. So having looked at some history and some scripture and some philosophy and too much history, in the autumn we're going to look at the practical outworkings in particular cases of the impetus given to the Church's missionary activity by Maximum Illud. And the first of those is going to be Father Francis' lecture, which is going to look at the concrete example of forming local clergy and the resistance both within the local population and more widely to that process. So I can promise you that when you come back in October, that'll be really interesting. You better start writing it. I think there'll be drinks and nibbles afterwards. Have a very happy summer. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.